sophisticated along those lines, and not in terms of diversity. Okay. Iguchi and Kyle 2020 offered a really good summary of the many different ways in which people have been approaching this particular construct. I will be focusing more on how we look at this for L2 production, just because of my own primary interest, but I think they pertain to L1 as well, a lot of this. So the first way to look at this is to use frequency-based indices, which you're all very familiar with. We consider words with the lower frequency in a reference corpus such as the BNC or COCA as more sophisticated than words with a higher frequency, right? And then word range, okay? So basically words with a lower range in reference corpus will be more sophisticated. This means if you look at the range of registers, for example, or if you look at the number of different texts in which words occur, so the more widespread a word occurs, then the more the easier it is, because you encounter it all the time. If it only occurs in a limited range of text or domains, then it may be more sophisticated. And then psycholinguistic word information. So for this, we use psycholinguistic databases, which contain ratings of things like word concreteness, imageability, meaningfulness, familiarity. Basically, people who construct these kinds of databases ask L1 speakers to rate words on a scale of 1 to 5, right? You might say, Apple is very concrete, but hatred is much less concrete. Okay, the general idea is that the more concrete, more imageable, more meaningful, and more familiar words will be less sophisticated because they are easier to grasp and understand. And then the abstract words and not visual, with words with a more fluid meaning, and then words that are less familiar to people, as rated by L1 speakers, will be more sophisticated. We also look at age of acquisition and exposure. So the words that are acquired earlier will be easier, right? Those that are encountered and later by more people will be more sophisticated. People also look at semantic networks with the assumption that words with a higher degree of polysemy and a lower degree of hyponymy will be more sophisticated. Okay, so if you look at WordNet, for example, the more specific a word gets, right, then the harder it becomes, such as different kinds of dogs and things like that. And then a word with many more meanings will be somewhat harder than a word with a very clear singular meaning. We also look at the word recognition norms. So in lexical decision and word naming tasks, words with longer reaction times and the lower accuracies will be more sophisticated, right? We look at contextual distinctiveness. So this refers to words in this particular dimension, words used in more restricted associative, lexical, and semantic context domains will be more sophisticated. So by associative, we mean things like if you give people a free association task and say, okay, look at this word, what word comes to mind? Right, and you give people 100 words, and for each of them, they will give you 5-10 words that they can think of. Okay, so if a word is associated with a lot of other words, if among the 100, this word comes up for 50 of them, then it's not really restricted. But word shows up only for a very small number of words, then it's more restricted. Those words are harder to access. Okay, for lexical co-occurrence, this looks at the probability of a word occurring with highly frequent words. Okay, words that occur very often with these high frequency words tend to be also easier to access. But if they don't occur frequently with high frequency words, then they are harder. Semantic, people look at LSA, so latent semantic analysis. They will construct these kinds of contextual representations of each occurrence of word, and they will compare the semantic similarity of those representations. If the semantic contexts of different occurrences of words tend to be very similar, if they're occurring everywhere, then it's easier, basically. If they occur in fairly coherent and limited semantic context, then they may be more sophisticated. Then word neighborhoods, this is a formal feature. So basically words with fewer phonological or orthographical features shared with other words will be more sophisticated. Some words have silent letters, right? Like Illinois, Massachusetts. I still have trouble sometimes just spelling them. But the assumption is that if you have a word that has a unique phonological or orthographic feature, they may be more sophisticated. And then academic language. So words in academic word lists, or sometimes in a reference academic corpus, they will be considered to be more sophisticated than words that are frequent in a general word list. And then finally, some people look at the n-gram frequency and range, association strength in a reference corpus. So in addition to just words, individual words, they also look at bigrams and bigrams, trigrams, and look at the frequency and range and association of those kinds of things in reference corpus. So as you can see, there has been a lot of different ways to approach this idea, including looking at a reference corpora, right? How things are distributed in reference corpora or word list, and then also drawing from insights from psycholinguistics research. Okay, and then basically once you have a particular piece of text that you want to assess, you look at the words in the text, or sometimes n-grams too, and then you consult a reference corpus, a reference word list, or some kind of psycholinguistic database or WordNet to obtain information about the words in the current text in those resources. And then you come up with some kind of measure to get an idea of how sophisticated the words are in the sample, in the text in question. So here we have a summary of the different kinds of measures in TAALES designed by Kyle and Crossley 2015. And there were some example indices. I don't think we have time to go over those, but you will see that there were different ways of approaching this idea. So in addition to TAALES, which I listed at the bottom of this page, there were a few other tools that people have been using for automating lexical sophistication measurement. Earlier tools include vocabulary profile, which looks at primarily the frequency bands of the words in a text in a reference corpus, and then sometimes also how many words are on the academic word list. So typically top 1,000, top 2,000, top 3, top 5, top 10,000, and then also the proportion of words in the academic word list. Cometrics does actually includes a combination of different kinds of measures, including frequency-based, range-based, but also some psycholinguistic word indices as well. Text inspector is kind of similar to vocabulary profile, maybe like I see this as an upgraded version of vocabulary profile. It includes all the functionalities of vocab profile, but also it adds other functionalities, such as looking at usage of particular words of particular part of speech categories, for example. So you can look at things like percentage of adverbs per sentence, for example. And then I had a tool in 2012, but in terms of sophistication, I only have 5 measures that of all frequency-based, which I will show you in a little bit. And then TALE is a recent development, which includes a very large number of indices, which we will also use in the current study. Okay. So in terms of research on the relationship between lexical sophistication and L2 production quality, I will show you a few findings from a few recent studies on L2 oral and written production. So in my own work, I found that in terms of lexical richness, I looked at lexical richness in general, to the relationship of lexical richness to the quality of L2 oral production. And I found that the lexical diversity played the most important role. Lexical density had basically no effect. In terms of sophistication, I found that verb sophistication rule on indices were very useful, but not the sophistication of lexical word in general. Okay, so I found that frequency-based verb sophistication indices correlated significantly with test for English majors band 4 speaking test scores in China. TM4 is a required test for English majors in Chinese universities. And then Kyle and Crossley reported that among the many indices in their tool, 5 indices accounted for 51.9% of variance in holistic scores of independent TOEFL speaking samples. So that's a very robust explanatory power. And then in terms of writing, they reported that 4 indices accounted for 36.8% of variance in the scores of independent TOEFL writing samples. and 2 indices accounted for 8.3% of variance in holistic scores of integrated TOEFL writing samples. So we can see that there was various degrees of predictive power reported for these kinds of indices for different types of writing as well. But we could agree that we know that the lexical usage is only one piece of the many pieces of production quality. You mean there is syntax, there is coherence, there is topic development, there is relevance, and all of that. So, on the one hand, we shouldn't expect vocabulary usage alone to be able to explain all of the variance. And on the other hand, we can also see that it is useful, right? So I have some screenshots of the tables from those papers I cited. So this table summarizes my own indices in my previous tool. So I had the first one is irrelevant, is lexical density, but the other 5 in this table are related to sophistication. The first 2 are related to lexical sophistication. The first one is a token-based index, and the second one is a type-based index. So, the proportion of sophisticated lexical word tokens in a text, or the proportion of sophisticated word types in a text. And the bottom 3 are related to verb sophistication. So these are, as you can see, it's a combination of the number of types of sophisticated verbs or number of tokens of verbs and things like that. Okay, but they're all frequency based basically, and sophisticated words are defined using a frequency threshold in a reference corpus. In this case, COCA or BNC, depending on whether we're talking about American or British English. And I found that, as we can see in this table, only the 3 verb-related indices correlated strongly, significantly with L2 oral production quality. The first 2 also, but they were kind of more fluency and just length, but not lexical density and not the 2 lexical word sophistication index in general. We have some summary of the results reported by Kyle and Crossley 2015. So these 5 measures accounted for 51.9% of the variance in the scores of TOEFL speaking. If you look at these 5 measures, they actually come from different kinds of categories. So there is the trigram frequency in the BNC corpus, right? But only in the written written component of the BNC. And then there is a subtlex range. So this looks at the proportion of texts in this film subtitle corpus that the words in the current text appears in. And then AWL words, so basically the proportion of words in the current text that were also on the academic word list by Coxhead 2000. There is the familiarity score from the MRC database, right? And the last one is Brown frequency. So the frequency of content words, CW stands for content words. So frequency of the content words in the Brown corpus. You will see that, there was frequency, there was range, there was academic word usage, there was also familiarity, which is a psychological word index. Okay, and then similarly, a few other measures accounted for a fairly large proportion of variance in the independent writing in TOEFL, but a relatively smaller proportion of variance in TOEFL integrated writing. Okay, but I think the take-home message is that we do see measures from different categories contributing to accounting for variances in holistic scores. Okay, and then in their most recent research, because the tool was expanding to over 1,000 indices, which is kind of crazy. You can no longer look at the contribution of individual indices anymore, right? So they did a factor analysis, right? They categorized, they named a number of different factors with loadings from different indices, and they were trying to look at the contributions of different factors to L2 writing. L2 writing quality. And they found that, again, different dimensions and were contributing to the explanatory power of lexical sophistication. And I think the main idea here is that it should be seen as a multidimensional construct. Okay, so all of that shows us that we do have a good grasp of how we can approach lexical sophistication. And also we know that it does play an important role in L2 production quality, okay? However, you know, I'm sure that people all realize this, but it's a bit of a surprise now we haven't done much about it yet. So we can see that existing indices and tools have not taken into account the fact that the words are used with different senses in context, and that different word senses may have different degrees of sophistication, right? When we talk about frequency, for example, we are looking at the word as if it's just a word. But we know that words have many different meanings, right? And some meanings are less accessible than other meanings, right? It could be that some meanings are used very frequently, but other meanings are used less frequently. So sometimes using a less frequent, for example, metaphorical, idiomatic meaning of a word may actually indicate a good level of lexical proficiency. But this kind of information is hidden in current ways of looking at sophistication. Of course, we do have methods that take into account our polysemy, right? You know, some looked at the degree of polysemy of words. If you're using more words, if a lot of words in your text are actually polysemers, then they think that is a higher level of sophistication, but it doesn't get to the actual sense that the word is being used with in context. It just shows that, okay, this word is potentially more polysemous than all these other words. So we said, why can we take a look at this and see whether if we perform word sense disambiguation on the words in the text, and then somehow integrate that information into first step frequency-based indices, can we see different results, right? That's the general idea. So we have two questions. How does the predictive power of sense-aware lexical sophistication indices for L2 writing quality compare with that of existing indices? And then also how does it do in combination with? We're not trying to be competitive. We're trying to see whether if we add this information, can we contribute to improving the power of lexical sophistication indices, right? But of course, we do want to see whether these indices would contribute on their own as well, adequately well. Okay, so first of all, our data set, we use the CLC FCE data set. This is part of the Cambridge Learner Corpus. It consists of 1,244 exam scripts produced by L2 English learners sitting for the Cambridge ESOL First Certificate in English in 2000-2001. The reason for us to use it is because it is reliable. It has been reliably graded, so we don't have to worry about reliability in the holistic ratings. And also, this was a high stakes test, so it would have it's a good data set to use for this kind of purpose. But obviously, we want to apply our method to other data sets too. We checked the corpus and we eliminated a few empty files and a few files that had a 0 score, which we thought would not be very helpful for us. And then so we ended up with 1,236 files. The mean score was 27.9 out of 40. And then the SD is 5.372. We performed sentence segmentation and tokenization and lemmatization using the NLTK toolkit. And after doing that, we ended up with about 471,000 tokens and 7,405 types in the learner data set. And then to identify polysemous words, we used the Oxford English Dictionary Online because of its comprehensive word coverage. We had no trouble covering basically all the words in our learner corpus, and also the large number of example sentences for each sense. So the dictionary will, would list for each word, would list multiple senses, including at the same time it's part of each category. But for each sense, critically, it contains an adequate number of training sentences, example sentences that we can use for training. We found that in our learner corpus, we had 44,465 out of the 7,495 word types were polymorphs based on an analysis of the entries in the reference dictionary. So the other words would be, numbers, function words, determiners, things that at least the dictionary doesn't think are polymorphs, right? And then the dictionary listed, so for those 4,000 plus words, the dictionary listed 17,000 plus senses and 459,000 plus example sentences with an average of about 4 senses per polymorph word and over 26 example sentences per sentence, so which is great for us. And then we retrieved the sense information for all polymorph words, and then we built up a sense ID for each sense. So the way we did that was something like this. So when we first of all, the word express appeared in the exam script, right? And we found that it is polymorphs in the reference dictionary. So we would retrieve the sense information for this word. Then we build a unique sense ID for every sense. So express one, verb one would be a sense ID for the first sense entry in the dictionary for the word express. We would take the actual definition and then all the example sentences. So the ID, it is meaningful to us, but in a sense, it also doesn't matter. It just shows that we know it's the lemma, we know the part of the speech category, and we have these numbers. The first number for us meant this is the first part of the speech category. The second number means this is the first sense under that first part of the speech category. So something like that. But it allowed us to uniquely refer to any sense for any polymorph word in our database. Okay. And then, so once we have processed that, we would perform word sense labeling on every instance of every polymorph word in the exam script. So let's say we have this essay produced by one learner that you are analyzing. We have identified all the polymorph words, right, based on a comparison to the entries in the reference dictionary. And then for every sentence, we try to assign a sense to it. So the way we do this in 2 steps. First of all, we do a sense representation for which we use contextualized embedding. So first of all, this is done by training our model. We do this using the example sentences in the reference dictionary for training. So first of all, we retrieve, as we said already, we would retrieve all the example sentences from the dictionary for each sense for each polymorph word, so that we have done. And then when we are working at a particular sense for a particular word, we feed each sentence individually to the pre-trained BERT-based model. BERT also has a large model, but which requires more computing power. So we're using the base model, which we found to be adequate for our purpose. We use the pre-trained BERT-based model, which would generate a 768-dimensional contextualized embedding for each word in the sentence. So the BERT model has been, it's a recent model, but it was trained on 2 very large corpora. I think there was the book corpus, which contained 80 million words, and then the English Wikipedia corpus, which contained 1,200 million words. It has been shown to do really well, much better than previous models like Word2Vec, because it does take into account of the context of every word, as opposed to just the use of a word in the entire corpus. It is also very fast. Okay, we use this to, we feed every sentence to it, and then which will generate an embedding for each word in that input sentence. And then once we have processed all the training sentences for this particular sense, what we do is we compute an embedding for the sense by taking the average of all the embeddings generated for that word from the example sentence for this particular sense. Okay, so if a sense has 10 example sentences, we would build an embedding for that word using those 10 sentences, and we take the average of those embeddings, and we take that embedding as the sense embedding for S subject. So at the end of this procedure, every sense of every polysemous word was represented as a distinct 768 dimensional vector, right? And this we store, we store. And this, of course, only requires input from the reference dictionary. Okay. And then after we have built these sense representations, we can do sense labeling, which we perform on the learner data set, right? We adopt a semantic similarity approach. So first of all, we also perform sentence segment. We have performed sentence segmentation, tokenization, and such on the learner text, right? So given a text, we would analyze it sentence by sentence. If a sentence contains a polysemous word, then we will feed it to the broad-based model, and then we will compute the concise similarity between the embedding that the model generates for W sub I from the current input sentence. We will compute the similarity between this embedding and each of the M sense embeddings for that word that we obtained in the previous step. And we would label this particular word in the sentence with a sense with the highest similarity score. So this is a relatively straightforward procedure once we have obtained the sense representations. Okay, so we have comparing, examining the accuracy of the model on example sentences from the reference dictionary was relatively easy, just because you don't have to perform manual disambiguation, right? Because the example sentences already tell you what sense and they were for. And we found, using a test set consisting of unseen example sentences from the reference dictionary, we achieved an accuracy of 2.3%. And we are still doing manual checking of the accuracy of the model on the exam scripts, But at the same time, we are trying to see how predictive the indices that integrate the sense information can be. Okay, so here is an example of the sense label text. So because we performed the lemmatization first, you will see only lemmas and not inflected word forms. So and also basically we have these sense IDs, and they correspond to the unique sense IDs so I mentioned earlier. So he, one, pronoun one will be this he used as a pronoun and the first sense under the category pronoun. Okay. And then also, in order to determine whether a particular sense is complicated or not, we have to have a reference corpus. So for this, we use the component of the corpus of historical American English, comprised of text from 1980 to 2009, basically the more contemporary portion of that corpus. And we had 66 million words total for that component. We could have used a larger corpus, but there were two considerations. Number one, we had to buy the corpora, and we already had this corpus. That's a practical consideration. But we thought, we would need two kinds of distributions. One is a word frequency distribution. For that, we think this size is already kind of adequate. And then also our primary concern here is not really word frequency distribution. It is more sense frequency distribution, right? So for that, we thought we couldn't possibly perform word sense disambiguation on the entire corpus. That would take a very long time. So because of the computing power requirement, we decided to do a sampling. Okay, so first of all, we did also sentence segment and tokenize and lemmatize the entire reference corpus. But then in order to estimate frequency distribution of word senses, we for each of the 4,000 plus polysemous words found in the exam scripts, we randomly sampled 500 sentences containing that word. Okay, and then we would perform automatic sense labeling on those 500 sentences, and then we would estimate the frequency distribution of different senses of the same word in that 500 sample. Then we kind of populate that to the entire corpus size. We estimate, okay, if you appeared 100 times out of 500, we are saying that you account for a quarter. You're accounting for 20% of your occurrences, and we would multiply that by the frequency of the word and pretend that it is the estimated frequency of this particular sense in the entire corpus. Okay, so that was the approach we took. I mean, we could increase the sample size and see if that's going to change the performance, but for now, we were doing just this to get an idea of whether it's worth pursuing. Okay, and then once we had all of that figured out, we started thinking about ways to integrate this information into our indices. So we had two types of indices. One is frequency-based lexical sophistication indices. These are traditional ones, right? Just for comparison purposes. So we define sophisticated words as those with a frequency lower than k in the reference corpus. And then also in addition to those, we define for the other three sense-aware lexical sophistication indices, we also considered polysemous words with a frequency higher than k in the reference corpus, but tagged with a sense ID with an estimated frequency lower than k in the reference corpus. So it's a combination of both types of sophisticated words. Either you have a low frequency overall, or you have a sense that has very low frequency. Okay, we set k to 3000 empirically. I will show you how we did that. So here we have a summary of the measures. Once you have the definition of sense-aware sophisticated words, then I think all these measures become pretty straightforward. We use root ratio just to mitigate the text length effect. But basically it is the ratio of sophisticated words, right? We have two versions. One is just frequency-based measure. The other is frequency-based, but also we look at sense-aware sophisticated words. Okay. And this would allow us to do direct comparisons of whether once you add in this sense sophistication, do you see improvement over a straightforward frequency-based measure? In order to determine k, we started with 500 and then went all the way up to 5,000 with 500 intervals to see at which point do we see overall good correlations between the index and the L2 writing score. And we thought 3,000 seems to be a good balance for the four measures combined. So we decided to use 3,000 as the frequency threshold for both word frequency and sense frequency. Okay, so for analysis, we performed the stepwise multiple regression analysis. We performed the three analyses, one using 484 indices from TALES, which included different kinds of categories of indices. And then the 6 ones proposed in the current study, and then everything combined, right? We would only enter an index into the model if it's significant and meaningful. And then we examined whether we have normal distribution of the residuals of the model to see whether the model is a good fit. And then also we checked on multi-collinearity by looking at the VIF values and made sure that everything would be smaller than 10 for the significant predictors. Okay, so these are the results for the first model. These are the correlations. You can see USF, CW. This is the association. Right, this is the word association task measure, right? So the words that are not, the words that don't come to mind for every single word you give as a stimulus, those kinds of words will be harder basically. And if a word comes up every time you give them a word as an association word, then they would be basically less restricted. So that particular measure correlated the most strongly with L2 writing score in our data set. But you can see down the road a lot of other types of measures: frequency, trigram frequency, familiarity, and so on and so forth. We only listed the top 10 here. And then in terms of the regression, we saw that the 14 indices ended up in the model, and they accounted for 14.7% of variance in the holistic scores of L2 writing. Okay, but again, the idea is that we do have different types of things, some reaction time ones, some concreteness ones, academic language, range, frequency, familiarity, polysemy, and so on and so forth. So 14.7. And then these are the correlations of the 6 indices that we proposed. So we found that 3 of the 6 indices actually had a stronger correlations than everything here, which was kind of encouraging. Right. And then we do have two, the mean, logarithm, frequency, and whether you have sense or not was not just, they were just not very useful. But the other ratio ones, the root ratio ones, were all pretty good. And even the first one would be the second highest if you put it in here. This would be only lower than USF CW. So these four appear to be pretty good. But the most important thing for us is that for each pair, right? The first two is a pair, the second two is a pair. For each pair, once you plug in sense information, correlation does go up, right? And then in terms of the regression model, the two measures with sense information actually accounted for the majority of the variance in this model. But together, they only accounted for 9.4 with the three indices that ended up in the model. So this is smaller than the proportion of variance that was accounted by this one, right? So here, so keep that in mind. So, and then of course, for us, we're not trying to compete with that directly just because that tool had a lot of models, had a lot of indices of different kinds of categories. And we wanted to see, number one, whether we did see that individually they are useful. And then we did want to see whether when we combine everything, do we end up with a better performance. So with all the measures entered into the regression model, we found that one of our indices, the ratio of root ratio of sophisticated word, sense-aware sophisticated word types actually contributed the largest amount of variance in this model, right? And two of the models made their way into the final model, and then we ended up explaining 19.7% of the variance overall, as opposed to either 9.4 for our indices or the 14.7. Okay, so this is kind of it's encouraging information because we have only played with a very simplistic way of integrating sense information. I think we should explore more effective ways of doing that. So I will just quickly summarize what we found so far. So number one, integration of sense level information into frequency-based indices of lexical sophistication proved useful. As I said just now, for each pair of indices among the 6 that we proposed, the sensor-aware index exhibited a stronger correlation, right? Even though for the third pair, the correlations were pretty weak. But even if you become fuzzy, you will see that for the last two pair, well, actually that one is a little, they are not really very useful for some reason. But we can see that for the two pairs that were actually meaningful and significant, we see that sense information was useful. And then also one measure exhibited the strongest correlation and predictive power among all indices considered, even when TALES had a very large number of indices of different kinds of categories that have been shown to be useful. At the same time, I think our results also confirm Kyle et al.'s notion of lexical sophistication as a multi-dimensional construct, because in the final model, we do see that different types of indices were contributing to explaining the variance in the holistic scores, right? It's not just frequency or range, but we see different types of information being useful. We need to look more closely at the contributions of words of different part-of-speech categories. That's not hard to do. But I think more importantly, we want to explore more sophisticated ways of integrating sense level information in frequency-based indices. So for now, we only naively added one way, one type of sophisticated words by saying if you also have a low frequency sense, then you are also sophisticated. But we are exploring more ways, just other ways of integrating that information. And at the same time, we only looked at sense level information for frequency-based indices. But as we mentioned just now, there were a lot of other kinds of types of indices, right? Academic words, for example, range. So we think we should also explore the integration of sense information in other types of indices of lexical sophistication. Okay, so I think it's a very simple study. It's just, we are focused on looking at adding whether adding this one thing would actually be useful or not, right? Given that word sense disambiguation has played a very important role in many other NLP tasks, but in L2 research, people don't seem to pay attention too much to this obviously useful information. So we thought we wanted to see whether it would be useful. Okay, that's why I had to say thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. It's a great talk. So now we can, whoever wants to ask any questions, so you can just unmute yourself and ask a question.
I have a question. Thank you for a wonderful talk. If I remember correctly, at the beginning, you were talking about using, was it production data as the measure, right? And then this new study is looking at written data. I'm wondering about using production data and how that might change, or oral production data, this sense level information with the time pressure involved in oral production, as opposed to this written data from the Cambridge test, and how you think that might change things.
Yeah, that's true. I think first of all, we would have to empirically evaluate. I mean, one thing we haven't really done, we have that information, but one thing we should report maybe, and then also to address your question is to even just compare to what extent do people use words with different senses in speaking versus in writing, right? I think that will give us an idea of whether it is even worth integrating this information or not. If people don't do that as much, right? Theoretically, hypothetically, it is useful, but if, it's rare, right? It's not frequent enough, they might not be that useful, especially given the cost of doing all of this, right? Gotcha. Yeah, but I think you're right. I'm not sure. I've learned that we really cannot be sure right away. Do we have a lot of, do we use words in many different ways in speaking? I guess it will to some extent depend on the prompt, right? The task. Right. And, but there were two kinds of words. Some words like make and, and do, they are kind of polysymers by nature. So you can use make and do in very different ways in speaking or writing, but then you do bring in these more specific, domain-specific words. I guess it depends on that, but I think it is worth empirically evaluating the extent to which we use polysemous words, number one, and then also we use different senses of polysemous words. That will give us an idea of and also, I'm not sure whether the sense labeling system will perform as well. We would have to also evaluate how well it performs there. So we start with writing. We actually started working on word sense labeling using the BERT model on L1 text, because that's obviously more accurate. So 92 is pretty good. And then we do this L2 writing, which we think is still okay. But then once you go to speaking, then you have this another layer of other ones segmentation, like reliability of doing that. When you have these hesitations, repetitions, like where do you end? Do you get rid of them? So we're gonna have that too. But I think that was the accuracy as well. I don't know whether you have any intuitions as to whether people will be using, number one, more polysemous words, right? And number two, more diverse senses of
right. I think I agree with you that it has to be related to the task, but I was thinking more about, like, we talk about these differences in my SLA class all the time, where my students are like, just give the students more time with these written tasks and then they'll do better. But when you push to do that output and they have no time to think, then you might start to see those individual differences, but you're gonna have like all the struggles you mentioned. So I can see why it's a good place to start with written data.
Although I think one thing to make this useful is to think, because traditional frequency-based indices do not take into account of the sense of what being used, it could be that in speaking and in writing, you might use the same word, but you may be more likely to use a more frequent sense in speaking than in writing. I suspect. I mean, that's not going to be true for all words, but I think for many words, it could be the case. right? So this could be useful if we think in that way.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, thank you.
More questions? I think, Xiaofei, you mentioned, I think I just maybe don't remember. So when you talked about the previous work and all the previous indices that were developed in the past, so you mentioned WordNet, right?
Yes.
So
That's
how does
on
it
this
correlate
page.
with this? So WordNet also provides senses, right? In a
Yes.
different way. Not, it doesn't give you the distributional information, but it gives you
Right.
senses, right?
Yeah.
So did you look at the differences between what word can give you as senses and what embeddings give you as just to compare? Did you compare anyhow? I'm not sure. I don't have a very clear idea of what I'm trying to ask. So the comparison between the senses that are provided by the knowledge-based kind of database, right, and a distributional approach.
Yes. Yeah. So WordNet was used in previous research primarily because they were concerned with two things. One is whether you would have multiple entries of the same word in WordNet or not, right? And if you do, how many do you have? Okay. And they are kind of less concerned with how many sometimes even. So some could be binary, is it polysemous or not? But some do look at how many senses. Okay, so they wanted to look at the proportion of words in a text that were found to be polysemous in WordNet. Okay, and so and the other one is WordNet is great for having this taxonomy, this hierarchical structure, right? So you know, dog is a type of animal and so on and so forth. So you could look at the depth of a word in the WordNet, in WordNet, and therefore the assumption is that the lower a word is in this hierarchy, the more specific it is, and therefore the more sophisticated the word it is. Okay, so for our purpose, we wanted to use a dictionary for two reasons. It has, basically a much more comprehensive coverage of words and senses in general. And then more importantly, it has a very large repertoire of example sentences that we can use for building, for training and deriving the embeddings for the senses. So that was why we were using a dictionary rather than WordNet. But even though people used WordNet, they have never used it, at least in indices of lexical sophistication research. People were not trying to perform sense disambiguation. They were just trying to see, do we have a polysemous word or not, right? And then also, where is it in this hyponymy hierarchy? So that kind of information, yeah. That's why we, it's, in a sense, we don't want to use that for the particular purpose of what we're doing here, which is to basically, we wanted to perform sense labeling and then have a way of estimating the frequency distribution of senses in a reference corpus.
And now it's really not my area, but just a big question. So there's second language acquisition theories and this sophistication lexical indices. How do they contribute to the big picture?
Yeah, so in second language acquisition research, right? Because there were theories of learning, right? There were theories of what affects learning. But you have to look at learning. So how learning, you have to measure learning first of all. Only when you are able to measure learning can you talk about how it is taking place and what is affecting that. So in terms of tracking learning development, in terms of measuring performance, people use CAF measures. So on complexity, accuracy, and fluency measurements, right? So within complexity, linguistic complexity is a big part of that. There is a cognitive complexity, but linguistic complexity is a big part of that, right? And that, also has a lot of sub-constructs, but among which a syntactic and a lexical complexity are two that people can relate to very obviously. So that's why I think if you look at the larger picture, SLA researchers are all very aware of the importance of looking at accuracy, fluency, and the complexity measurements in production data in general. And they would look at, for example, what kinds of task complexity factors would affect that, for example, right? And what is the trajectory of development of those kinds of things? Do they develop at the same time? Are they competing with each other over time? It's a very complex picture, of course. But lexical sophistication would fit into this construct of lexical complexity, which is part of linguistic complexity, which is a part of complexity, basically. Right. So, but then of course, people who are more applied, they're like, okay, I just really want to have things like automated asset scoring. Okay, so it's more practical. They are more concerned with can we find measures that can predict scores, like the E-rater stuff, speech rater stuff, right? So this also has uses in that. But of course, in doing this line of research, we want to have a construct validity, right? We wanted to say, well, we are constructing indices that are based on what we think are important components of a writing construct. Okay, so if you go that way, I think all I said just now still is relevant, because when you construct a rating scale, you mention these are the important dimensions we have to look at as a human rater, for example, right? These are the important aspects of good writing. So it's still relevant there as well, although the primary concern is we want to look for things that can improve prediction. Okay, so my work kind of relates to both. So sometimes I would collaborate with the SLA researcher looking at, even for people with the same level of proficiency, right? And you measure their sophistication, you measure their fluency and accuracy, syntactic, lexical, but if they're writing for very different kinds of things, right? Argumentative essays as what's the story, for example, and then whether they have time pressure or not, right? Whether they have reference or not. You can see that things change. The complexity of the language changes. So it's not as straightforward as just taking a snapshot of one thing and say that's your level. You have to consider a lot of different kinds of factors. And there were hypotheses on how different factors will cause learners to perform in different ways, right? Some say if you give them a more complex task, they will produce more complex language, because the task will demand a more complex language. Others will say the more complex your task becomes, then you have these cognitive load. You cannot attend to everything well, because you have to attend to task demands, you have to attend to accuracy. They argue that the language will become less complex. So people do test, people test whether people want to see which theory is more robust, but in any situation, you have to have ways of measuring complexity. So that is why some people focus on finding more reliable and more valid indices of complexity. So this line of work also kind of fits there, right? And then people argue that there is never one single straightforward way of measuring any subconstruct. That's why we see these, many different ways of doing that. I mean, you can debate on which ones are more or less valid or relevant, but this just shows that people are trying to approach, and this is just for lexical sophistication, right? I mean, if you look at syntactic complexity, which I've done a lot of work on, that's a very different story. People fight, they hate each other, and they say, you cannot just look at this, you have to look at that, or you just cannot look at this. But it's the same story. There were many different ways of approaching it. So Kyle, whom I know very well, then I took this very, ambitious approach by, I'll just give you everything and you can pick whatever you want, right? Kind of approach. So that's great. But we are just saying, well, since disambiguation has been around forever, right? I remember the days when we were graduate students, we read about it. I mean, it's been there forever, but it's somehow, even the words are so important and the word usage is so important in L2 learning, I'm sure we address it as a human being when we talk to our students, but we don't seem to do much. This is not complicated work, but people don't seem to have done this before. So we just wanted to see what is relevant or not. Yeah, and the extent to which this could be useful. I guess this might be more useful for more advanced level writing as well. So I don't know. I mean, the usefulness of this might also depend on the level of proficiency of the learners. I don't think it will be equally discriminative, for example, predictive for learners at different levels. So there were a lot of things we have to explore, but it seems to be useful, at least to some extent so far.
So I think sense is also used for readability metrics, right? So
yes, yeah, it could be useful there too, I think.
How did you deal with multi-word expressions?
Not in this study. No, not here. Are you talking about bring in sense information for multiple expressions?
Well, it's a broad class, so some of them,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on, because it's the same thing. Yeah, for n-grams, we just think of the n-grams, right? We don't think of n-grams. We don't think of the same n-gram as being different n-grams. But if some n-grams could have, if an n-gram actually can be used in different ways or have different meanings, then an n-gram is not just an n-gram. It's the same idea. But I guess that would, but it's harder than words, I think, even. So we would have to have a way of talking about different meanings or uses of the n-gram so that we don't just treat an n-gram as if it's just one n-gram. But that's what people do right now, right? I think it's already being useful. But maybe bringing, as we get more and more accurate with these kinds of things, then it could come time when you do deeper work on even n-grams or multiple expressions to say, well, it's the same form, but different meanings, different uses, one metaphorical, one not, for example. Yeah, that could be useful too, I agree. I don't know how to do that because, like for words, we have a reference dictionary, right? That tells you this information. But for that, you would have to build up something. You would probably treat the n-gram as something, as a unit, and then, build embeddings for them somehow.
I guess you would need to extract multi-word expressions and then represent them with embeddings.
Yeah. But it should be doable. It should be doable. Yeah. It could be useful too. Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Any other questions? I don't see people here, so you can just unmute yourselves and ask whatever you want to ask.
I have one much more simple question, I think, which is the L2 data is coming from the Cambridge exam?
Yes, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about the externals of it? Who takes it? What are their goals and that sort of thing? I'm just kind of trying to get some sense of where they would develop this sophistication and how others could too, I guess, yeah.
So this is not IELTS, but it's kind of like IELTS. So it's by Cambridge University Press. They have this Cambridge ESOL First Certificate in English test. So anybody can take it. Any L2, any second language English learner can take it. It doesn't matter where you're from. But the thing is, if you take it and you pass it, you will get this B2 certification. So they have A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, right? C would be advanced, B would be upper intermediate, basically. But the B2 level, it appears to be a very interesting milestone. So it's not the most advanced yet, but it is a very important level of certification. It's almost like if you pass it, you'll be ready for college, for example.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, so something like that. In a sense, it may be comparable to TOEFL, but I mean, it's more fine-grained. But the learners would be anybody actually. And you don't have to have you could be a college student, could be a high school student, could be somebody who's already working, but it's more certification that you get.
And do you know what sort of proportions of, how many people test out with an A1 as opposed to a C3 or whatever the different levels are?
Yeah, so this one, either you get a B2 or you don't get B2.
Aha, okay, so.
you won't get anything else. It's like you
Oh.
know, it's unlike TOEFL, right? You get a score. This one is you get B2, you don't get B2.
Ah, okay. And
Yeah, so it's not IELTS. IELTS is like TOEFL. You will get a specific score, and then depending on your score, they will say you are here or there. So this guides you for B2 only. Yeah.
And the scoring is done automatically. It's done by
No,
humans.
This data set was done by humans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this was done by
Interesting.
humans, and these were the official scores from the testing authority. So it would be, I mean, we would have to explain how this was done because, you know, these were the scores that official scores that people were assigned to. But the total of writing was 40 points. I think that was 20% of the test. So it was 200. The full score was 200. Yeah, but that's about it. That's what we have. That's all the information.
Mm-hmm.
I remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.